case that untrained thinking can cause a lot of damage in external science, it is the case specifically in the anthroposophical movement that, more so than through inaccurate observation, even greater damage is caused, because an interest in suprasensory things does not go hand in hand with an equally strong interest in logical thinking. And such purely logical thinking can be trained particularly well through a reflection on the thinking of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Such a reflection will also be able to throw a certain light on our present time. People talk from time to time about going back to Hegel, but we cannot say that our time has the intellectual prerequisites which would advance an understanding of Hegel. The whole of Hegel's thinking grew out of a time in which there was the most intense interest in deriving the foundations of all knowledge and existence from perspectives of the highest order. And it is no coincidence, but a deep necessity, that Hegel lived in a time in which these foundations of the highest order were sought in the greatest variety of fields. Hegel was born in Stuttgart on 27 August 1770. He became a student at the Tübinger Stift, 1788 to 1793, that institution which played such an important role in the development of German intellectual life at the time. His fellow pupils included Schelling, who towered over him and outshone him for such a long time, and the deep-natured Hölderlin, who was soon to descend into madness, even if not because of his deep nature. They formed what might be described as a trefoil, the deep-natured Hölderlin seeking in mystical light and shade, Schelling with his energetic, sharp thinking and brimming over imagination, and the somewhat ponderous Hegel extracting his thoughts onerously from out of his soul. Schelling and Hegel subsequently worked together again at Jena University, which at the time was a hothouse of intellectual life. Schelling thrilled his listeners with the mighty sweep with which he dealt with intellectual problems. He even thrilled those who did not by inclination seek to penetrate the questions of existence. Schelling pointed to something which goes beyond all thinking in human existence, to the, as he said, intellectual intuition, which he thought of as a primal ability to look into the substrates of existence. Hegel was a fellow lecturer of his from 1801 to 1806. Even at this time, still his thinking was ponderous, because he wanted to make each thought never comprised more than it was intended to mean. And it is this slow, penetrating ponderousness of his thinking which makes Hegel not at all easy to understand to begin with. Then came the sad time of 1806. During this time, Hegel undertook, as he himself put it, the actual great intellectual journeys of discovery. As the cannons thundered at Jena, he concluded the first of the works to emerge from a detailed, incredibly profound collection regarding the spirit, the title Phenomenology of Spirit. This is a work which is unique in the whole of world literature. Hegel wanted particularly to clarify for himself the experiences which the soul can have when it ascends from subordinate perspectives, as it were, to the highest, to what Hegel calls the constitution of the spirit in itself. To begin with, we live in the most dulled possible connection with the external world, in which every this or that, every tree and every house, is something with which we live together. Every opinion is something in which we live. Only when we start to reflect on this and that does perception arise. From perception we then get through the thinking to an initial sense of self, an obscure inkling of the self. Only then do we get to the first flashes of a real consciousness. But here the I, capital, is still spellbound within its surroundings. It works its way out of this enchantment through the content which it is meant to have solely out of itself, in that it leaves more and more of what is connected with the external world. In this way, self-consciousness comes about, and thus the interpenetration, the interweaving of self-consciousness with the spirit. It becomes spirit itself, grasping itself within itself, becoming spirit, growing conscious within itself. And when human beings then look back, they perceive what grasps itself as spirit within itself. They perceive the idea, which they have extracted, as it were, from its enchantment in the external world. They perceive that they were previously stuck in the contradiction between subject and object, but that now, in overcoming subject and object, in the idea which grasps itself, which is not just subject and not just object, they grasp what Hegel calls the absolute idea. Thus, through an incredible effort of thinking, Hegel had come to establish so-called absolute idealism. Hegel's fortunes varied considerably after his Jena lectureship. He worked for a time as a political journalist in Bamberg, 1807-8. Then he became headmaster of and taught at a school in Nuremberg, 1808-1816. And thus, through many different external experiences, became the realistically thinking spirit, which we encounter subsequently. After Nuremberg, he briefly obtained a post at the University of Heidelberg, where he published his titled Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in 1817. Hegel might well have said about the reception of this work, the words which legend has it, he expressed shortly before his death, quote, "Of all my pupils, there has only been one who understood me, and he misunderstood me," close quote. It is indeed a very peculiar feeling to have immersed something so incredibly profound into the stream of the world, and at the same time to see how almost all the conditions for acceptance of such profundity are missing. We have to adopt Hegel's perspective to draw something like a skeleton of what this titled encyclopedia was intended to be. But I would ask you, when I speak now from the perspective of Hegel, not to start viewing me as an Hegelian. For Hegel, it was a matter of continuing to develop the perspective he had developed in the titled Phenomenology of Spirit, which he had obtained through placing himself on the standpoint of the idea beyond subject and object. And now, to elaborate this perspective, if I may put it like that, in order from that perspective to survey human thinking and activity in all its scope. According to Hegel, the concepts of subject and object, of cognition and opinion, and such like, could not be contained in the absolute idea. The idea is beyond all such contrasts. Hegel wants to understand the idea as if it were being presented in all its purity, this idea which, although it is at work in subject and object, goes beyond both. This idea may well be found in human beings, in the external world, in spirit and nature, but it goes beyond both. It lies beyond spirit and nature. In Hegel's view, the idea must therefore not be understood as something abstract to begin with, like an abstract point, for example. On the contrary, it is something replete in itself, which out of itself, as the idea, allows a rich content to grow out of itself, just like the plant seed implicitly contains the whole of the plant with all its individual parts. Thus, according to Hegel, the idea allows a content to grow out of itself which is independent of spirit and nature, which, when it is applied, must be applied to both. Before, then, considering the meaning of spirit and nature, we obtain a perspective higher than both, and then see in nature a manifestation of the idea, and equally see the idea coming to expression in the spirit. We thus have to obtain a perspective from which the idea is developed in such a way as if the human being were not present at all. Human beings then surrender to the very own process of the world of ideas developing in itself and out of itself. This perspective produces what, in the meaning of Hegel, can be called the science of logic. Here we are not dealing with a subject and object, as in Aristotelian logic, but with the independent movement of the idea located above subject and object. Any thinking which only wishes to devote itself to the things of the external world finds it difficult to gain entry to the strictly closed ranks of the Hegelian concepts. We feel as if violence is being done to us, as if we are being shoehorned into a system of ideas which has nothing whatsoever in common with the normal, everyday rationale of reason. The idea is meant to think, not I. That is the feeling we have. That is why people mostly also do not engage with Hegel's world of ideas. But if we do so, nevertheless, well, we might correct Hegel here or there. That is very easy, particularly with Hegel. But that is not really the point. The point is that people undergo enormous self-discipline in their thinking through the study of Hegel. Because there is nothing like Hegelian logic to learn where a system of human concepts, indeed a concept as such, can occur. A concept can only be recognized with all its implications if it can be thought of only in a certain location within a whole web of concepts. In order to clarify that for himself, Hegel starts with the emptiest concept, the concept of being, which is normally just placed without people generally being aware where they have placed it. Now, this concept is meant to be completely empty in Hegel. So as we enter Hegel's logic, we have right at the start to ignore all later content which this concept has obtained. That is, we have to be very disciplined in our thinking. Thus, the concept of being is not established by human beings, but it is what faces human beings when all other concepts have been excluded from it. Now, Hegel wants to find the method for developing concepts. In other words, one concept has to develop from another. Thus, the concept of being, if we look at it in the right way, must immediately elevate itself above itself. As soon as we apply the abstract concept of existence to a thing, that abstract concept is no longer pure. It is then already related to a this or that. In this way, we learn to understand that being is nothingness, but please note, only within the concept. Through such a self-referential dialectic, we have thus derived the concept of nothingness from the concept of being. Once we have created discipline in our thinking in this way, we have educated ourselves at this point of Hegelian logic already in a way of thinking which in Hegel's further discussion of being and nothingness is only ever applied in the way as has just been explained. Being and nothingness now produce a third thing, becoming. But in order to grasp becoming, it has to be brought to rest. Thus, in fourth place, the concept of existence emerges from the concept of becoming. This is the only way that existence can be used in Hegelian logic, as being which has inverted itself into nothingness, which, together with that, has produced becoming, which, brought to rest, produces existence. And Hegel continues using this method. He obtains the concepts of one and many, quantity and quality, measure, and so on. Thus we have an organism of the idea in the first place of Hegel's title Encyclopedia. Only once we have grasped all the preceding things can we reach the concept of purpose, which stands at the end of Hegelian logic. Such absolute logic does indeed achieve an immense self-discipline, which should be held up to our time at least as an ideal. It teaches us to express a concept only if we have its content completely in our consciousness. We must not, then, have anything in our concepts other than what at some point in our lives we have clarified for ourselves as the development of the concept. Subsequent concepts which appear in Hegelian logic are subject and object, knowledge, essence, causality, which are now, however, clear in our consciousness. Once Hegel had established the complete system of concepts in this way, he was able to show how concepts reveal themselves in what we might call their enchantment. The concept cannot only be in the subject, because then any talk about nature would be meaningless. On the contrary, our concepts underlie natural phenomena, have made them. Thus it is irrelevant, with regard to the concept, whether it appears internally or externally. Externally, it is hidden from us. Nature is the concept or idea in its otherness, as Hegel says. Anyone who says anything different about nature goes beyond what they know for certain. The result is a kind of natural philosophy, a natural science which seeks the development of the idea externally, after it has first been sought in itself, in its purer existence, in logic. To begin with, the idea comes to expression in subordinate phenomena, where the concept is most hidden, so that we might be tempted to refer to natural phenomena devoid of the idea. That is what happens in mechanics. But even within mechanical phenomena, Hegel's disciplined thinking distinguishes between two things. He distinguishes ordinary mechanics, such as underlies phenomena like thrust, force, and matter, relative mechanics, as he calls it, from absolute mechanics. In other words, he considers it inadmissible to apply the ordinary concepts of relative mechanics to the heavenly bodies. Only when we develop the concept of absolute mechanics do we find the idea which lies in celestial mechanics. There is, however, no trace of that distinction in today's science. Hence Hegel's polemic against Newton, who particularly was most intent on applying the concepts of relative mechanics without further thought to the concepts of absolute mechanics. Starting from the concept of absolute mechanics, Hegel proceeds to the concept of the real organism. He identifies the three elements of the organism as, quote, first, the geological organism. In Hegel's sense, the complete structure of the earth must not be understood as the laws of a small area being extended to the whole earth, as is done by geology today. Hegel sees what we might call a rigidified organism in every mountain range, in every geological form. Second, the plant organism, in which the concept reveals itself in equal value with the idea, in uniformity with the idea. Third, the animal organism, which in a certain sense already presents the existence of the idea in the external world. Close quote, readers aside. This is an indented section. I am not sure, it might be a typographical error in the publishing. That might have just been Steiner and not a quotation. End of readers aside. What the idea appears to be in earth existence, the enchanted idea, as it were, has thereby exhausted itself. Human beings now emerge from these enchanted ideas. Initially, they have to be understood through their natural characteristics. That is the subject matter of anthropology. In their perception, human beings find themselves in a dulled state in external existence. But when they rise to consciousness and from there to self-consciousness, they detach themselves, in a sense, from external existence. This is where anthropology is followed by the, quote, phenomenology of spirit, close quote. Within this phenomenology, human beings finally grasp themselves as spirit. They recognize themselves as subjective spirit in that initially they struggle free from the enchantment of nature. Gradually the idea itself appears to them once again. What it was in the first, very first, concept of existence now comes to the fore. Once human beings have, in this way, recognized the idea in itself, in logic, and outside itself, in nature, they now understand it where it is in and of itself. Now, this initially subjective spirit turns itself into objective spirit. The idea highlights what it is as such in what are the spiritual institutions: marriage, family, law, morals. All of that is combined in the state. What emerges in the state as objective spirit, as realization of the idea, what can be found in the interaction between states, that is world history. Thus, world history is the existence of the idea after its passage through the subjective spirit. And the question arises, can we close the circle at the end like a snake biting its tail? That is, can we get back to the absolute idea, to a realization of the idea which overcomes the subjective and objective again? The absolute idea can, in its absolute reality, initially appear as something preparatory, so that it is not enchanted, hidden as in nature, but such that it shines through appearances. That is the case in art. Beyond world history, Hegel thus creates the first realization of the absolute idea in art. But here it still has something of an objective, of an external nuance. But it can also act in such a way that it no longer has a nuance of the external, but a nuance of the internal. That is the case in religion. So it is the realization of the absolute idea on the second level. But the idea can also overcome the nuance of externality, which it still has in art, and the nuance of internality, which it still has in religion. It does so in understanding itself, at the point where it catches hold of itself in philosophy, in an Hegelian sense. And thus the circle is closed. In the whole field of history there is nothing which is as self-contained as the Hegelian system. Later on he elaborates individual parts, such as the philosophy of right, 1821, a field in which a strictly disciplined thinking is particularly beneficial. Now Hegel says something remarkable in the preface to the title Elements of the Philosophy of Right. When reason takes hold of the idea, everything must be understood, because we see the idea. That is the action of reason in things. Everything real is therefore rational in an Hegelian sense. These words can, of course, be immediately refuted with the arbitrariness of ordinary reasoning, if we fail to take account of the context of Hegel's thinking. If we, therefore, place Hegel's philosophy in outline before our souls in this way, we have recognized immensely disciplined thinking as the basic tenor of his philosophy. Hegel then taught this philosophy from 1818 to 1831 in Berlin, where he died on the 14th of November 1831, the same date that Leibniz died, who had set out exactly the opposite philosophy. Hegel's philosophy is centered on the idea which remains wholly with itself. In Leibniz, the idea is scattered in the immense number of monads. But just a single monad, which contains the pre-established harmony, would, if it developed, need to take the path of the Hegelian absolute idea. Thus Hegel's system lies in the development of a single monad. Hegel set up the strictest monistic, Leibniz the strictest monadological system. For as long as we remain in Hegel's columns of thought, we remain in a strictly closed loop of the spirit. How do we get beyond that? if we measure Hegel's system against monadology. That is indeed what happened to one thinker, that for him Leibniz's monadology broke open Hegel's monism. That is what happened to Schelling. Having been silent since 1814, he was appointed to Berlin in 1841, 10 years after Hegel's death. He tried to go beyond Hegel, with whom he had worked in the past, and from 1802 to 1803 had published the title Kritische Journal der Philosophie. They were unusual lectures, which he now gave in Berlin. There is only one way to get beyond Hegel. It is only possible by drilling a hole from outside at the point where, in Hegel, the I, capital, grasps itself in the phenomenology of spirit. We also remain stuck in Leibniz's monads if we do not drill a hole there in the same place. If we start at that point, we get beyond the I, capital, which only grasps itself. Then we get to super-sensory experiences which really go beyond what Hegel comprehends in his system. And that is indeed what Schelling does. He started to teach theosophy, real theosophy, even if in an abstract form. And he met with the same success which a person would have today who wanted to teach theosophy at a university. Schelling teaches a triplicity of the foundation of the world, a threefold potency. First, the capacity to be. Second, pure being. Third, the combination. Thus he set out then what today we seek in the threefold logos. Then Schelling sought to understand the secrets of the ancient mysteries in his title, Philosophy of Mythology. He sought to teach what we investigate today, helped by super-sensory experiences which have become possible since then. For example, in what my book titled Christianity as Mystical Fact says about the mysteries of antiquity. Then Schelling strove for an appreciation of the Christian mysteries in his title Philosophy of Revelation, which attempts to throw a light on Christianity from a theosophical perspective. Schelling was only able to give these lectures because he had previously stood at the lectern with different views. Now the rage against him was all the greater. All the textbooks and other histories of philosophy today present this last, quote, theosophical period, close quote, with great horror, a period in which he went totally mad, having previously established the insanity of his, in quotes, intellectual views, as they put it. But with this transition from Hegel to Schelling, an age simultaneously arose which lived completely under the spell of natural science. And since then we are experiencing a strange spectacle, through the observation of which we will be able to see why theosophy, spiritual science, has to be received today in particular in the way it is received. There is no one who admires the results arising from facts more than I do, and yet the following has to be said. The discovery of plant and animal cells by Schwann and Schleiden in the 1830s was a great attainment, but petty opinions followed on from it. The theory of energy and matter arrived, which considered anything spiritual to be merely the froth on physical processes. The worst product of such a way of thinking was the strict framework within which Büchner framed theoretical materialism in his book titled Kraft und Stoff. Büchner's audacious courage is something to be admired, of course. The other researchers were simply not brave enough to think their thoughts through to the end. But more subtle minds also went different ways from Hegel and Schelling under the constraints of natural science, such as Hermann Helmholtz, who did great things in the fields of psychophysics, the physiology of the senses, physiological optics, and the theory of sound. His discoveries led him to reject Hegel through the way that experiments were conducted and through the suggestive power of the experiments, not through his thinking. So that he said, "When I open Hegel and read a few pages of his natural philosophy, that is pure nonsense." And there was another subtle and cognitively trained spirit whose thinking was misunderstood, Julius Herbert Meyer, who discovered the law of the conservation of energy. His law did indeed have great physical importance, and this was acknowledged. But Meyer's thinking about the mechanical equivalent of heat in his work, titled Die organische Bewegung in ihrem Zusammenhang mit dem Stoffwechsel, 1845, was never understood. People much preferred to read Helmholtz. He was much easier to understand. Thus people preferred to read his work, titled Wechselwirkungen der Naturkräfte, 1854, in which he proved the correctness of Meyer's law on the basis of the impossibility of perpetual motion. Then the achievements of Darwinism came along, and such a bold spirit as Haeckel, who, however, was averse to any intellectual culture, and could therefore not see anything in Hegelian philosophy other than a tangle of concepts. This courageous spirit was now called upon to develop the scientific facts in the sense of external material historical development. Thus he was the founder of the materialistic Darwinism of the 1860s and 1870s. No philosophical direction of thought rose up against that. The world was no longer capable of being gripped by philosophy. There was nothing of a reciprocal relationship between philosophy and science. Thus a thinker as important as Edward von Hartmann, who in his title Philosophie des Unbewussten, 1869, called materialistic Darwinism, before the court, we might say, of a spiritual philosophy, was abused as a dilettante who has no idea about science. There were many publications against him, including a brilliant anonymous one, titled Das Unbewusste vom Standpunkt der Philosophie und Deszendentie. My apologies. 1872. Haeckel said about this publication that it was so excellent and showed up the errors of the philosophy of Edward von Hartmann so thoroughly that he himself, Haeckel, could have written it. And Oskar Schmidt, Darwin's biographer, very much regretted that the esteemed colleague wished to remain anonymous. Then a new edition of this work appeared, and Edward von Hartmann revealed himself as the author. Thus philosophy in the most unsubtle way provided the evidence that it is very well able to understand science, even if trained thinking leads to quite different conclusions from those of materialism. It is indeed the case that this struggle is not just word against word, but cultural forces are opposing one another. Subtle minds always retained their understanding of both things, philosophy and science. But they could only ever be heard in the smallest circles because of the dominant suggestive power of science. Thus the extraordinarily subtle history of philosophy by Vincenz Klauer, titled Die Hauptprobleme der Philosophie, which set out great perspectives, could only be understood in the smallest of groups. Indeed, not even what the narrow Herbartian philosophy was able to produce against outer materialism had any effect. So it happened that a strictly logical mind, even if trained in scholasticism, which wanted to build a bridge to scientific method within itself, could not even do that within itself. This is what happened to Franz Brentano, who wanted to combine scientific method with strictly logical thinking in his title Psychologie vom empirischen Standpunkt, the first volume of which appeared in 1874. But his disciplined thinking was not able to make any headway. He himself was still too much subject to the constraints of scientific materialism. He could not deal with himself, and so the second volume, which had been announced for the autumn, failed to appear. And today Brentano lives as an old gentleman in Florence, and the second volume has still not appeared. I myself witnessed the terrible struggles which this division could cause in the individual soul. I saw how the methodological aspect in training the thinking directly lost its power through the suggestive power of science. It happened during a formal meeting of the Vienna Academy in the 1880s, at which I was present when Ernst Mach gave a lecture about economy in looking at natural phenomena. He indeed failed to find a way to grasp natural phenomena within his method. With each sentence, it was painfully clear how all methodology of thought disappeared, how everything shrunk to the principle of the least use of energy in understanding nature. In this way, thinking was reduced from the ruling position it held in Hegel to the least conceivable economic importance. Thus, Hegel remained what we might call under an enchantment, and even a Kuno Fischer was not able to release him from his spell. It turned out to be true what Rosenkranz said in the introduction to his Hegel biography. We philosophers in the second half of the 19th century are, at best, the grave-diggers of the philosophers of the first half of the 19th century. And with that he meant biographers. A new revival in the methodology of thinking then appeared to be provided by the works, going back to Kant, of Otto Liebmann, Zeller, and so on. Liebmann wrote one of the most sharp-witted treatises which have ever been written in the field of epistemology. He used every means to attempt to establish a transcendental epistemology, but finally nevertheless ended up with a kind of epistemology which we might crudely describe as comparable to a dog chasing his tail. He did not get beyond the starting point of his epistemology. And that is how we reached our present state. Clausius, importantly, developed the theory of heat, which influenced the physiology of the senses, which in turn influenced epistemology. Once again, then, a spell was cast on philosophy by science. Thus those who spoke on the basis of the former trained thinking were silenced. It is true that in the 1880s, a researcher, starting from Kant, really sought to develop epistemology further, but he was not heard. Thus, circumstances forced him to abandon that area completely and move over to aesthetics. It was not until 1906 that it was Johannes Volkelt, published a small epistemological work titled Die Quellen der Gewissheit unserer Erkenntnis, the sources of the certainty of our knowledge. The conditions for a true epistemology existed as little as for a true understanding of Hegel. Our time is much more satisfied by something like Spencer's Encyclopedia, which goes a tiny bit and very superficially beyond science. And when indeed the concept of the smallest economic measure, as set out by Mach, returned from the New World in the pragmatism of A. William James, it was enthusiastically received as something new. Certainly the strict columns of Hegel's absolute logic and the totally unphilosophical reasoning of pragmatism make rather curious bedfellows. But what is good cannot be suppressed completely, only for a time. Healthy thinking stirred, on the basis of the power arising from a people, we might say, where a misunderstood Kantianism was not able to coat the thinking like mildew. Thus the Russian philosopher Soloviev did indeed bring new important methodological approaches, in that he was based in the strength of a young people, which, if you want to put it like that, had not even produced a proper culture, but not in an old one like Franz Brentano. The Frenchman Boutros introduced a new usable concept into historical development. Such endeavors continue to be ignored, but the truth continues to smolder under the ashes. It can become overgrown with preconceptions and impotence, but it nevertheless continues working as self-discipline in the thinking. And those in particular who believe that they have to represent spiritual science must hope that such self-discipline of the thinking will smooth the path for spiritual science. They must find the way to the strictest Hegelian logic, because that is the only way to provide a firm foundation in the thinking for what they have to bring down in often loose forms from higher spiritual worlds. Thus, if we may put it like this, there is nothing in the supersensory field which would have to be rejected by a strictly trained thinking. sharper, self-disciplined thinking will find the transition, the bridge which leads from the last highest product of the physical plane, the thinking, to the supersensory. The end of Lecture 2. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. As well, you can hear these podcasts at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. As well, there are two publishing houses, steinerbooks.org in America and rudolfsteinerpress.com in England, which are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of Collected Works, Volume 125 by Rudolf Steiner. 14 lectures entitled Paths and Goals of the Spiritual Human Being, Life Questions in the Light of Spiritual Science, translated by Christian von Arnim. This is Lecture 3, given in Copenhagen on the 2nd of June 1910, and this is the first lecture. We will deal with a specific subject in these 3 days. We will talk about the paths which the soul of the human being can take in the context of a spiritual scientific view of the world, about the goals of theosophical life. To this end, today's lecture will provide a kind of introduction. Tomorrow and the day after, we will then advance to the actual inner part of our reflections. Today our standpoint will be more of an outer one, I might say, and start with the question, is what we feel to be the spiritual scientific view of the world something which has been brought about through the convenience of individual personalities, or do its foundations lie in the soul of our time itself? Do we have something before us which is connected with the deepest needs of our age? We can best approach an answer to these questions if we are clear that all those who come to spiritual science from all kinds of different professions, be they rich or poor, strong or weak, are seeking souls. All of them are seeking souls who do not always know precisely what they are seeking, but feel that they are seeking something. They are often souls who have gone all kinds of different ways and have let those things act on them which the present can provide. Souls who have sought to satisfy their longing in this or the other field of art. Souls who have looked around in what science can offer. Souls who, more or less darkly, more or less brightly, have felt, after laborious searches, that they cannot find in the present what coincides with the searches of the soul. Such souls are frequently touched by what the spiritual scientific movement can give, and say, yes, here an impulse lives, which is different from elsewhere, different from what has its origins in the life around me. What do such souls feel? Or what can they feel if they come into contact with what we may call theosophy today? We must not think that these seeking souls who find their way to spiritual science are the only ones who are seeking. They have been chosen, or they choose themselves, from a great number of seeking souls. Anyone who listens to what is spoken out of the deepest needs of our time will see that there are many souls who say, we thirst for the means to have the great riddles of the world answered for us, and we do not find that all the things provided by tradition, all the things which modern science has to say, can answer these riddles. Let us listen for a moment to what these souls, the best among them, have to say. They say, approximately, the following. And with these words, which flow out of hundreds and thousands of such seeking souls, we encounter something like the longing heart of our time. We look back into the distant past and see how from centuries to centuries, from millennia to millennia, the various ideas about God and nature have followed one another, replaced one another, and led to conflict between their representatives. Many things have been passed down to us. Millions of people confess to such ideas and follow them out of an honest sense of truth. But just as many can no longer confess to what has been passed down out of such a feeling of truth, they feel out of a sense of love of truth that they have to let the old views go. What was it like in the far distant past? At that time, people might, for example, Look at the river flowing from the heights down into the plains. Look at the beneficial effect of that river and ask themselves, what speaks to us out of the rush of this river? What is it that is at work in this river? And they found something in it, which they also found in themselves. They found that it was based on a spiritual something, a divine being. They found in the flowing river a divine spiritual power which rewarded them, which gave people what they needed for their well-being. They found something spiritual at work in the blowing wind, the rolling thunder, the flashing lightning, which was the same as in the flow of the river, the sound of the surf. They saw something in it of which they said, what lives in my soul is related to the murmur of the brook, the rage of the storm. They may speak a different language, but there is something similar there nevertheless, and I feel I can understand it. Something similar was felt by those to whom Moses brought down the tablets of the law. They felt that a being spoke out of them which was infinitely greater than the father of a family. But what spoke out of the thunder and the venerable head of the family was nevertheless related. They felt the Spirit throughout. They experienced a living bond between what lived in them as pain and joy and the external world, a bond which these people in times immemorial were able to understand. That is what the best say. And if you go where serious science speaks, not trivial superficiality, you can hear the following. Our ancestors looked up to spiritual powers. They did not just see rippling water, blowing wind, the fire of lightning. They saw spiritual beings in these natural forces, gnomes, undines, sylphs, salamanders. Whatever we might think about these people, they were understood by their contemporaries, those people who wrote their belief as poetry into the external world, belief which gave them strength and stability. And now the best of these seeking souls add, we can no longer believe in gnomes, undines, sylphs, and salamanders, in spiritual beings of nature, because we have been taught that iron laws work down as far as the smallest atom, and we have to think of the external world as a construction of these. We can no longer fill it with life as our ancestors did, can no longer hold sacrificial ceremonies and rites which send up our voices, can no longer say when we are racked with pain, do not despair, because life in the spiritual world will give you all the greater comfort. And a large number of people say, our whole world has become different. We no longer build on what was built on previously. If in earlier times someone had been pierced by a rusty piece of metal, they would have sought comfort with spiritual beings. Today we do better to go to the doctor and use the resources of external medicine. That is what we use today, to treat what previously would have been treated with what lives in the soul. Some argue against this, that we cannot be without the belief in a spirit. We cannot do without that. A spirit is at work in all laws, is at work in thunder, the same as in the atom. And a person only needs to have gone beyond the most terrible trivialities of materialism not to be able to deny such an insight. When seeking souls use the word spirit in this way, what do they mean? What is spirit? Where do its roots lie? How do people obtain an idea of the spirit? A strange view is being spread today. In America, people are talking about a new religion. The latter only wants to recognize a God who works in the laws of nature, down as far as the atom. No one today can imagine a God in human form, the representative of this teaching says, but we cannot do without a divine spirit. And so this personality says this peculiar thing. The laws of chemistry are not enough. But from where should we take the content of an idea of God? And so we hear the following. We have to think of the spirit which is at work in nature in such a way that it possesses the characteristics of the human soul. People are not, therefore, prepared to imagine a God who possesses human characteristics, but they do not want to have something which gives substance to such an idea of God. And here we have the result. We cannot do otherwise. We cannot take the content of our idea of God from anywhere other than the human being. And the representative of this worldview further points out that in earlier times divine beings were venerated, who inspired and filled people with their power and urged them toward a task. We cannot now, of course, believe any longer that there are supersensory beings who act as inspiration, but the future will venerate advanced helpers, wealthier spirits, who have something to give to the poorer ones. So you see, in place of what happened in earlier times, feelings nevertheless occur, which cling to those who can give comfort. After each earthquake, for example, there will be those who can give comfort to the many who have lost their dear ones. There will be human love when the supersensory helpers no longer exist. Can you not see the strange contradiction which occurs here? We are to look to those who give comfort. But where do they obtain the things in their soul which they need so that they can give comfort and love? Thus we find among the best ones that although they seek, the soul must feel that it faces emptiness. And what happens in science? Is comfort found in what science has brought us? Let us fully acknowledge the beneficial effect of science. But we must not forget one thing. How much of the purely physical pain which human beings have had to suffer since prehistoric times has been relieved? People have certainly not become stronger and healthier since then. Of course, there are many medicines which provide relief, but we have to draw attention to a contradiction here. External science believes that nothing can be lost. When we rub something, for example, the energy occurs as heat. Something that disappears reappears as a different kind of energy. Analgesics reduce pain, and people talk as if the pain had disappeared. Here there is a contradiction with that simple law. When the pain disappears, it reappears somewhere else. We can alleviate as much external pain as we want. It is transformed into soul pain. And people are not aware that these things are connected with the relief of outer pain. This should not prevent us from doing what we think necessary to relieve outer pain, but we have to learn to understand the connections and not indulge in illusions in the spiritual field. They have no idea, these seeking souls, that people situated in outer life today can, for example, be drawn into the powerfully developing field of industry and technology by what is presented to their eyes. But those who look more deeply can see this intoxication, this enthusiasm has to be paid for with something. You know that souls are becoming increasingly desolate, that they feel the answers to the riddles of existence less and less. Of course, we should make available in all areas what can relieve pain. But we should not forget that even when we satisfy the outer body, we can allow the soul to starve, can inflict more and more pain on the soul through unrelieved longing. That is the mood which overcomes people, who not only observe human activity in a loving way, but who have an overview of the course which the future will take. There is much talk of the goals which people can set themselves, but in the intoxication which overcomes their soul, when they are gripped by the swirl of external life today, they fail to notice that the soul has to remain a seeking one. And why? Let us place before our soul only at the deepest level the discrepancy in what we feel today. When we cut our finger and make it heal again, with the best medicines known to us, we know that the same laws of nature are at work as in our environment. We have been formed out of the whole of nature, out of the laws which govern around us. But at the same time, we feel the necessity to see something other within ourselves. We see that spirit flashes out of people's eyes, spirit speaks out of their hands, spirit sounds out of their voice. And in recognizing this, we also feel ourselves as the bearer of the Spirit. We feel that we have been created out of our environment, but not alone from it. What rules this environment? The laws of physics, laws of chemistry, what we know today as the iron laws of nature. That is not sufficient to explain the spirit. The things provided by physics, chemistry, and biology are not enough for that. Where are the roots of what we can address as spirit? The spirit is within, inside ourselves, but homeless and rootless. We can understand the chemical composition of the blood, can precisely grasp the combustion process which takes place in us, and everything which is subject to the laws of physics and chemistry in the external world. But as soon as we see external nature with the spirit removed, everything becomes rootless. We cannot say that it is the same way that the blood is subject to the laws of the blood circulation, so something spiritual follows the laws of the environment. Spirit cannot be found in the latter, the seeking. Lost soul of the present says, I will not find the answers there which torment me. From where will they come? Now we can see where the problem lies. We see that our ideas about the external world are becoming ever clearer. But then human beings want to be rooted in something with their spirit, with their soul. The soul cannot but want to do that. It cannot escape from itself into a desolate, chemo-physical existence. That is where the split occurs. The soul has the need to imagine a spiritual being, but nowhere in the external world can it find what corresponds to its present-day ideas about a spiritual being. That gives rise to a deep untruth. People today cannot believe in sylphs, salamanders, undines, and gnomes. But the thing which could give them satisfaction does not exist. The soul stands there without substance. The deeper this is experienced, the less truthful it becomes when we talk only about the spirit. Either we find the spirit or we have to insert it artificially. It might appear to many that what has just been said is too far removed from daily feelings. But we will find souls everywhere whose pain has its origin in these foundations. What spiritual science brings seeks to respond to this great search. It endeavors to build a bridge between the soul itself and that which is outside, be it that the soul is listening to the raging storm or watching the gentle play of the waves. People are no longer capable of idealizing gods acting in the air and water from out of the characteristics of the human being. We have to prohibit ourselves from seeing an anthropomorphic image of ourselves in what we describe as divine beings. That is what the present time has learned. But the converse is the impotence of the seeking soul. On the one hand, it is told, if you find a God, you must not give him human characteristics. On the other hand, we have the consequence that we are not able to create a replacement for ourselves. Because these seeking souls are missing anything that would justify this almost self-evidently arising fact, they are at a loss. Where can they find the firm foundation that would give them security? That is only possible if human beings once again acquire the right to conduct research into the spirit, if they look more deeply into their interior. People in earlier times made do with less. People today are no longer satisfied with the former. Spiritual science tells people today, you have taken the wrong path. Are the characteristics which human beings have found to date all the characteristics? Are there not deeper foundations? Do we not find something hidden of which we can say, quote, yes, this could be related to what I feel to be the divine, close quote. There has to be something which has deeper foundations than all the things which people have understood about themselves until now, which gives them the right to transfer human soul characteristics to the divine. But how do we find the path to the foundations hidden in our own interior? Here spiritual science points us to the paths which previously only few people went. Today, many people need to be told about these paths, for there are two paths. Firstly, the path of mysticism, and secondly, the path of occultism, in the true sense of the word. Let us look at these two paths. What is the path of mysticism? In order to understand this, we only need to place a particular moment before our soul. You all know that we say in spiritual science that the person in sleep is not the same being as when awake. On going to sleep, the inner part of the human being leaves, and on waking, descends back into the physical body and the etheric body. Generally, people do not take account of the fact that something else still happens in this process. Do we ever see from the inside that which descends? Then there is a mighty transformation in human beings. In the moment in which they descend, they do not see their etheric body and physical body from the inside. Otherwise, they would see that their corporeality is illusion, Maya. As ordinary people, we see the environment and that part of us which we can see from the outside. Human beings do not see what works and lives within them. They only see the external part, which they also see in stones and minerals, because their gaze is diverted to the external world as soon as they descend into their lower bodies. Those who strove for a conscious awakening were the mystics. They experienced a conscious descent into the external human being. All the images of the inner life, which are familiar to the mystics, are what human beings can see when they turn their gaze away from the external world, from what normally captures their gaze. The mystics experience what human beings are when they look at themselves from the inside. There they do not, for example, see how the blood circulates, but they see that the blood is the bearer of divine activity. They see that the blood is a shadow of divine reality. That is what the mystics experience, the spiritual motor of their own being, instead of external Maya. What the mystics tell us is true. Let us listen to what they report. This descent is connected with what we call trials, temptations, the awakening of selfish drives. Read the descriptions of what the soul is capable of unfolding in terms of base instincts. We have to go through whole layers of passions, desires, selfish inclinations of which we barely think ourselves capable. All of these things have to be overcome when we want to penetrate to the deep layers of our own being. It is a wise provision that our gaze is directed away from our own interior to begin with, because human beings are not mature enough to descend consciously into their own interior. They have to fight everything that rears up in them when they have trodden the path of overcoming their own egoism. Only then do they find the true human being, who is concentrated in the smallest space, the point of the I, capital. Only there are we fully within ourselves, know ourselves in good and evil, see what human beings really are when they find themselves beyond the layer which is formed by the instincts and desires, and when they have outgrown everything which they have become through education and convention. We have to pass through this layer if we want to penetrate into our interior. There is another way to obtain an understanding of the spirit within ourselves. It is not easy to follow, and is protected against those not ready for it, because it also contains its own dangers. Alongside the important moment of waking up, there is also the moment of going to sleep, which is equally important for looking at the human being. Let us look at it in greater detail. At the moment when they go to sleep, human beings pass over into the spiritual world, into the world apart from physical reality. Their consciousness stops. It is extinguished. Normal human beings do not, in a conscious way, have the spiritual world around them. If they were to penetrate the spiritual world before they were ready, then they would be afflicted spiritually to the most extreme degree with what in the physical world is being blinded. They would be blinded by a direct view of the spirit infusing the external world. Once again, it is necessary to strengthen human beings to such an extent that they are not blinded by the Spirit infusing the external world. That is done by means of the occult path. Through this they find their eye not closely compressed in their own interior, but poured out over the whole external world, at one with the external world. That is the occult path. In learning to tread both these paths, the path of mysticism and the occult path, an important fact appears before the eye, EYE, of human beings. Let them find the point where they are most compressed in their own interior, and let them be poured out over the whole of the external world. Then they will ultimately experience one great mighty thing. What you experience when you descend into the depths of your own self, and when you pour yourself out into infinity, is the same thing. Mysticism and occultism. They go in opposite directions, and they lead to the same goal. Human beings discover something that has been asleep in them, that is enchanted in the external world, that can be found in the deepest part of their own soul and outside in the world of appearances. They find what lives as spirit behind appearances, and they find the spiritual in themselves when they have united with the mystical path of knowledge and with the occult path of knowledge. That, then, is the bridge with which the chasm can be bridged, before which the seeking soul of today stands, when it recognizes that it itself is something other than the world appearances outside, yet cannot combine itself in its characteristics with what surrounds it outside. Today there is the possibility of finding a path which shows how that which lives in us is nevertheless the same as that which lives in the external world. The seeking souls which stand outside our endeavors do not yet know it. That path is shown by spiritual science. The theosophical movement wants to be a signpost toward this goal. It will provide answers to the questions which are posed by the bleeding, struggling souls of today. These questions will sound into the present, and spiritual science will give the answer. That gives it its inner justification, and shows that it is not the arbitrary result of some people's mind, but a need of our time. Spiritual science will once again indicate ways and means to find a harmony between what lives in the environment and in the human soul. It will lead us to recognize the laws at work in nature, not as empty abstractions, but as thoughts of divine spiritual beings. In this way, it will rediscover the spirit in the external world. Souls today are empty and desolate because they cannot do that. They can only obtain comfort, help, and strength in seeking the paths and goals of the spiritual human being. That shows the profound justification of such spiritual scientific striving. When we understand spiritual science in its deepest sources, we will give the soul the nourishment which it craves. We'll open up sources of spiritual action for it. And because all things external are an expression of the spiritual, over time, also health. The longing and searching of the present time give spiritual science its goals. The end of Lecture 3. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. As well, these podcasts can be heard at RudolfSteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. As well, there are two publishing houses, SteinerBooks.org in America and RudolfSteinerPress.com in England, which are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of Collected Works, Volume 125 by Rudolf Steiner, 14 lectures entitled Paths and Goals of the Spiritual Human Being, Life Questions in the Light of Spiritual Science, translated by Christian von Arnim. This is Lecture 4, given in Copenhagen on the 4th of June, 1910, the second lecture. When we speak about the paths and goals of the spiritual human being, we will repeatedly be faced with the question, why should we think about following such special paths? Why are we pointed by spiritual science toward setting ourselves such goals? The answer to that has to turn into sentiment and feeling for us. It has repeatedly been pointed out that forces are slumbering in human nature, and in nature which are striving to develop and which can be developed. Apart from the human being who can see and hear in the physical world, each person has a higher human being within themselves. The latter exists in embryo as a kind of seed. Spiritual science makes us aware of that with ever greater urgency. This is a human being of whom ordinary consciousness does not know a great deal. We have to have a clear sense of the following. The thing of which we have an overview right now is our ordinary everyday human being. But the one who is slumbering in us, who is predisposed within us as a seed, is a spiritual human being. Whether the latter develops or not is dependent on our ordinary human being. We can prepare the ground with the forces of our ordinary human being, but we can also leave it unprepared and not bother with it. Then we neglect our duty toward our spiritual human being. We can prepare the ground for this higher human being through spiritual science itself, through what it can give us as teaching and information. If we transform such insight into sentiment and feeling, that will give us the answer to the question, is it not a higher kind of egoism to concern ourselves with ourselves in this way? For as long as we have not learned about spiritual science, it is our karma to wait. But once we have heard about the higher human being slumbering in us, it is our duty to do those things which can bring those forces to development so that we can better fulfill our tasks in the world. We cannot therefore speak of egoism in this context, but only of the obligation toward our spiritual human being. That is the correct attitude of the theosophist with regard to external life. Theosophy tells us a number of things which have been obtained through spiritual research. But that does not mean that everyone who wishes to live theosophy needs to be a researcher into the spirit. The more we can tread the path of our inner development, the better it is. But before we ourselves achieve results in the field of spiritual research, we have to allow others to tell us its content. If we have considered the question for a sufficient length of time, external life will confirm the reports of the spiritual researchers. Once we have understood this information with healthy logic, we have obtained the possibility of ascending to higher worlds. Reason and logic are safe guides in this respect. The question can arise, how should we use this information? How should we approach it? Take the truth which we describe as the law of karma. It says that we find events in later lives on earth which refer to earlier incarnations. The more we make use of such laws of spiritual research in life, the more we will see how true they are. Just as we will never find a triangle in the sensory world whose angles do not produce the total sum of 180 degrees, so the circumstances of life must always confirm what has been found as a law in spiritual research. And if the karmic effects do not appear to us to agree, then this will most likely correspond to the minor deviations which might arise when measuring a circle with a planimeter. The result might perhaps be 361 degrees the first time and 359 the second time. But that does not invalidate the law itself. Equally, the law of gravity is not upset if a push makes the plumb bob of an Atwood machine swing to the side. It only proves that a different result is achieved if a new force is applied. Spiritual research further shows how we are faced with repetitions of previous periods within the life between birth and death. What we acquired, for example, in early childhood, between the ages of 3 and 7, returns in its karmic effects in very old age. If we study how someone spent their early childhood, we will discover a remarkable connection in old age with these childhood years. If they developed healthy needs instead of having been subject to the outer constraint of specific rules, their old age will take a different form. But it frequently happens that people graft onto or cram into the child's soul what they consider to be the right thing. But that is beside the point, because each child must develop the want to do this or that from his or her own volition. It then turns out that a person can retain their health in old age, that they can retain a freshness and inner strength into the final period of their life. There are, meanwhile, even more significant connections. You can learn much from the handwriting of people about the way their past has been developed. In the age from 7 to 14, it is necessary that human beings are educated not to make use of their reason prematurely. Authority must have the effect that truth appears to us as such. If we can admire the people who surround us in that section of our lives, this can stand us in good stead in the last but one section of our lives. To look reverently up to the wonders of nature in a prayerful mood are beneficial factors for later. Happy acceptance of authority returns in transformation in such a way that it becomes apparent that such a person has authority. Reverence, which children in this period are able to develop, has the consequence that they become people who, without needing to do anything, only need to be in the company of others in order to appear to have a benedictive effect. The hands which were never able to fold in reverence will never be able to give a blessing. Those who have never learned to bend their knee will never be able to give a blessing. Once you have fully understood such a law, you will find it confirmed. In this way, we can already trace the effects of the law of karma in the period of a human life. Thus, life everywhere gives us proof of laws which are at work in all fields. Circumstances can, of course, occur which conceal the law. In physics, we have the law of falling bodies, for example. Imagine an object which, at a given moment, moves through space without any support, wholly without external influence. As a result of the law we have just mentioned, this object will approach the Earth with increasing acceleration until it hits the Earth. The object will move toward the center of the Earth in accordance with very specific laws. It will fall. Imagine further that suddenly the falling object is hit by a horizontal impact. In this case, the naive observer waiting for the arrival at the relevant spot on the Earth of the object falling vertically as the result of the law of gravity will wait in vain. The object remains absent. Does that mean that the law of falling bodies has been negated? Of course not. It is just that another force has been added to the horizontal strike, and the object now moves toward the Earth under its influence in a curve which corresponds completely with the law of gravity and the subsequent additional force. At the place where, under these circumstances, the object hits the ground, its fall will be seen by an observer as something completely random, unpredictable. But that is not so. The laws are complete and incorruptible. The same applies in full to the law of karma, although we can only rarely follow it in all its compounded and entangled effects. That is why people are constantly inclined to doubt their karma. But however much external maya confuses us, we should only let ourselves be instructed by what has become law in our soul. Many who want to develop the forces of the spirit within themselves will not find it easy, because life, the physical, always squeezes in. All it needs is an obstacle in our life, and we easily allow ourselves, through a wrong judgment, to be carried away into hurling an insult, for example, without thinking of the consequences of our action. We hit a person and are unaware that we have raised our hand against ourselves, because this blow will come back to hit us at the given time. The law of karma is everywhere at work. Everything that happens to us in life happens under the law of karma. But just because we consider this law simply as a teaching, a theory, that does not yet make us theosophists. There are two feelings we have to make our own if we want to work on our spiritual human being. On the one hand, we have to tell ourselves, everything about us could still achieve greater perfection. There is no limit to our ascent. At every moment, the feeling of imperfection must be an incentive to want to climb higher and higher on the ladder of perfection, which has no highest rung. We have to keep placing that before our soul, because otherwise we will not advance a single step in our work on our spiritual human being. On the other hand, we should say to ourselves, a second step is necessary. At every moment we should feel that an infinite possibility of perfection lies in us. We should make our hidden human being as large as possible. That appears to be a contradiction, and human beings must feel it as such. Our development is packaged between these 2 points, the feeling of our own imperfection and the striving to make the hidden human being as large as possible. Those who strive as mystics to enter into their own interior, who wish to make progress through inner contemplation, must pass through the first point. They have to make humility their own. The best rule which mystics can make for themselves is this: to think of everything they encounter in their own interior as being as imperfect as possible, and to disregard their own personality completely. Because anyone who descends into their own interior must be prepared to experience terrible things. Stories of tragic events take place in the inner world of human beings who dare to enter the depths of their own being. A Tauler, an Eckhart, a Paul have something to say about that. And what was the help they sought against the dangers? Paul said, "Not I, but Christ in me wishes to act." Take with you the master, the ideal, but alongside have the feeling that egoism has to be driven out. It is not their own I, capital, which should feel, want, and conceive everything. Their unworthy I had to be driven out. This feeling is very similar to the feeling of shame in ordinary people. Wanting to be someone else, wanting to organize something else into one's own soul, that is the path of mysticism. And what belongs to the path of occultism? The path of occultism leads into the external world. If human beings want to follow the occult path, they have to live in such a way that they gradually have to learn to become used to enduring the higher world when they leave their body during sleep. They must acquire the feeling of perfecting themselves to infinity. But here too a danger lies, like for the mystics when they descend into their own interior. We described the dangers which affected the mystics. They themselves spoke about them. Nothing is said about the path of the occultist. Each person must familiarize themselves with this danger on their own. When we look into our own interior, it would be bad if we had not learned to feel ourselves as a unity, which is infused throughout our whole being. Such being, able to hold fast to a unity, is torn apart by each passion which overcomes us. Anger, jealousy, hate destroy our power of being able to direct our gaze at the unity. And the worst thing is if we have not learned to concentrate, if we are driven all over the place. We have to learn to feel ourselves as a unity firmly and unaffectedly. If as occultists we seek the path into the external world, we have to discard our personality as it has just been characterized. Here we must not seek a unity which underlies the whole of the external world. Because when we turn outward toward the spiritual world, we encounter an endless variety of beings and circumstances. If an occultist were to attempt to penetrate the all-embracing unity which underlies the whole manifest world, they would perish. Imagine a drop of red liquid, and this drop is poured into a large basin of water. Liquid as the drop is, it would immediately dissolve into the mass of water. It would dissipate. That is what would happen to the insecure I if it wanted to enter the world of the all-embracing unity. We must not dare to penetrate there alone, because we would lose ourselves like the red drop is lost in the mass of water. If we want to enter the astral sphere, we are directed toward a multiplicity. We have to start with the multiplicity, with the beings who are higher than us, with those who have themselves in stages passed through a higher development, with the hierarchies of that world. We must not want to skip anything, because it would be a presumption to want to penetrate straight to the highest. We have to learn in stages to study with the help of the higher beings, if we want to understand the all-embracing unity. The arrogance to want to penetrate to the highest will most certainly lead us to stumble. We must not allow ourselves to be misled through our monotheistic ideas to believe that when the veil which separates us from the spiritual world slides aside, we will only see a single, divine, all-embracing unity. We see a multiplicity, and we have to turn our gaze to the multiplicity. But how are we meant to find our way? Pythagoras said, "Do not seek multiplicity with your eyes, ears, and senses. Seek it through the number." We should approach multiplicity armed with the number. Just as the mystics have to decant the ideal of higher perfection into their interior, so the occultist has to appeal to the number. And here there is a characteristic which is absolutely necessary, namely security. We have to feel secure. Because if human beings waver, what are they? They are a will-o'-the-wisp, a flickering light, and the world is a labyrinth. We need Ariadne's thread to find the way back. The number gives us firmness. That is what we have to keep our I-E-Y-E on. If you wish to enter the spiritual world, you have to step out of yourself, have initially to go into the chaos of multiplicity. How do we find the factor? Where do we find an ordering principle? We find it through the number, through the laws of numbers. We have to penetrate the nature of the number and learn to know its true value. The number alone can become our guide in the labyrinth. The number can teach us many things, and profound secrets underlie certain numbers. Take the number 2. Everything that appears in life is revealed in the number 2. Right, not without left. Light, not without dark. Everything that manifests externally is subject to the number 2. The number 2 is the number of revelation, the number of manifestation. The number 3 is the number of the laws of the soul, thinking, feeling, and volition. To the extent that something organizes and structures itself in the soul entity, it is subject to the number 3. Where the number 3 is revealed as one of the laws, there is an underlying soul element. We can find the number 3 in innumerable relationships. In the 3 logoi, we have the 3 basic forces which refer back to something divine and of the soul. The number 7 applies with regard to all things temporal: Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, Jupiter, Venus, and Vulcan, which designate the 7 consecutive evolutionary states. Where we see something simultaneously working together, we obtain the number 12, the 12 gods, the 12 apostles, and so on. The reduction of the fixed stars to the 12 signs of the zodiac is also connected with this. The number 12 teaches us another law as well. Think of materialism. Is materialism wrong? It does not need to be so as long as people do not carry it into the soul element. If we want to be materialists, we have to pay homage to vitalism. Then we learn to understand material life. But we have to choose a different perspective for the soul and spiritual entity. If we wish to understand the world in its abundance, we have to be able to adopt a variety of standpoints. We have to follow the practical path of the Spirit. Now, we might hear someone express the principle, you have to create a certain system for yourself, if you want to penetrate into the higher worlds. But that is the worst way we could go. We should, in contrast, first step out of our own personality, from the center which this personality occupies in its existence to the horizon of our physical existence. And only here, at the horizon, should we adopt a specific standpoint. First, the materialistic one, and look at it from the inside, from the one perspective, by which means, as already mentioned, we learn to know material life. Only then can we walk around the horizon and choose 12 different perspectives. That is the only way which can lead to real knowledge. Practical occultists have to become very selfless before they can walk the horizon in a circle. They receive unity in external and internal things, in that they have to forget their personal I, capital, 12 times. The end of Lecture 4. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. As well, these podcasts can be heard at RudolfSteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. As well, there are two publishing houses, SteinerBooks.org in America and RudolfSteinerPress.com in England, which are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of Collected Works, Volume 125 by Rudolf Steiner, 14 lectures, entitled Paths and Goals of the Spiritual Human Being, Life Questions in the Light of Spiritual Science, translated by Christian von Arnim. This is Lecture 5. Given in Copenhagen on the 5th of June 1910, the third lecture. If we asked a person in everyday consciousness, quote, what is it that we call the I, capital, close quote, we would get the answer that such self-consciousness had to be sought within the boundaries enclosed by the skin. Our view can be proven through the fact that the seat of the soul must be sought in the head and the heart. But spiritual science sees that differently, only it is not easy to understand. We come closer to the spiritual reality if we try to clarify the super-sensory facts for ourselves. People cannot come close to the truth with the concepts and words which they use without this research. We will get a good understanding of that if we make use of a single picture. Think of a seafarer sailing the seas. Here, the external factors are the important, the determining thing. How he sails the ship depends on the state of the ocean, whether islands appear in the ocean, what the sky is doing, and other things. The captain and sailors make their decisions on the basis of all these external facts. The external facts are what matter to them. Now, some might think that when the ship reaches port, she is at rest. All work stops for a period. But that is not the case. A different kind of work starts. There, the ship no longer does the work, but work is done on the ship. Damage from the voyage is repaired. The hold is filled with new cargo, and so on. In this way, the voyage and the time that the ship lies in port can be compared with human life, with life during the day and life during the night. Only there is one difference, and this is that human beings are not involved in the work during the night. During the work in port, the ship must be made serviceable by the workers and sailors for her next voyage. But everything which in the daytime work of human beings provokes action through the senses stops working at night. Our senses, which have done the work in our body during the day, are at rest during the night. The work of the day rests like the ship in port. And yet work does take place in the human being which makes him or her capable of starting a new day's work. In this way, we can come closer to the concept of what the actual spiritual part in the human being is. It is not enclosed by a person's skin, but extends beyond the physical human being. The actual spiritual entity extends its feelers into the human being. It sends the essential part, the spiritual part, into the human being. Where is the actual I, capital, located in the human being? we find the spiritual human being, the supersensory ego human being, surrounding the physical human being. And when we look at the human aura, which is formed like an egg, then the ego consciousness will work most effectively in the shell, in the auric egg. It is this fact which leads to a proper solution to the problem. I referred to 12 points on the horizon. The occultist has to know them. They exist there even if they are not recognized by everyone. These 12 points constantly send their forces into human beings. They are attacked from these 12 points in the various points of their aura. It is only because their eye surrounds them that they are capable of making the cosmic forces one with themselves. Human beings must feel that they are part of the cosmos. That makes them capable of perception, and in that way it becomes possible for them to acquire capabilities of apprehension which correspond to the points we have just talked about. They are embedded in these 12 points. The divine spiritual forces act into the human being through these points. If you are able to contemplate and observe this, you will understand the paths and goals of the spiritual human being. Human beings have to be able to integrate this feeling into their lives. Spiritual science enables them to become familiar with the sum of forces through which they can fulfill this transformation in themselves. Let us consider our simple everyday lives. Someone might hasten through the world and encounter many things on which they could reflect, which they could work on in their spirit, but they do not make the least effort to transform what they have experienced into work, or indeed even just think about it more deeply. The only thing they want to do is have, in quotes, experiences, and rush from one sensation to the next. Then there is another type of person who goes through life without paying the least attention to the external world. They brood on and speculate about their own thoughts. They do not notice what is going on around them. They are constantly brooding. Neither extreme is of benefit for human beings. But there is a middle position, and that is this: to interweave everything we experience with our own thoughts. This middle state is the most beneficial one for human beings in the external world. Let us assume a young man is preparing for his exams. He has worked hard, the time of the exam approaches, and with it the anxiety about the exam. The young man keeps thinking that on the day of the exam he might be asked the one question about which he feels least secure, about which he knows least. That is at work in his thoughts. The exam goes well, it determines the rest of his life. It is the gateway to his further life. Now, it can happen that in the further course of his existence, he is pursued by a dream, and in this dream the anxiety about the exam of his youth appears. All the things he thought he did not know at the time. The soul is intimately connected with this, and the occult observer sees the web that is spun in the dream. What is woven there has not contributed at all to the life that has passed. But the occultist knows that it will turn into useful forces in the next life. It can also happen differently. The dream stops at the age of 45. Observing himself, the person discovers that quite new characteristics appear. It might be experienced, for example, that in his advanced years he has a lot more courage than he possessed in his youth. The states of anxiety of his youth and the associated will to overcome them have been quietly at work in the inner human being. 45 years later, these forces have turned into their opposite. There is always something weaving and working inside the human being, and the thing which is at work there is the astral body. It works for so long in the etheric body until what has been experienced has been interwoven with the etheric body and has become a true characteristic. In normal life, it only appears as a characteristic in the next life, but quite unusual cases like the one just mentioned can also occur. In this way, human beings process their external experiences, and the same thing happens with the extrasensory situations of life, which require us to process them with our eye. How does the spiritual human being work with regard to external circumstances? The external circumstances come to us, but the web that transforms our abilities is spun from inside. We weave into the human being the things which originate in the eternal spirit. We have to approach the external, but the spiritual approaches us. Let us assume that a person, for one or another reason, becomes interested in something. For example, looking more closely at a tree. They have to approach the tree, must give themselves up to the tree in order to achieve a result. But it is different with spiritual results. They come to us. We have to wait for them to arrive. The key thing about external experiences is that they are transitory in nature. But those which come to us by way of theosophy are based on spiritual ground. We weave them into our interior as something everlasting. We have to go toward external things, but the spiritual has to come to us. And the more we make ourselves capable of receiving the spiritual, the more it ripples toward us from the spiritual worlds and turns into our property. The human beings who live as poets among us and have created and produced something are always those who, in times past, allowed the supersensory to flow into them. We have to learn to think more. We have to be able to think logically and in a reasoned way, and then make our soul very still. Then we will not have waited in vain. The Spirit will, correspondingly, flow into our soul, to which we ourselves have opened the way. We have to learn to preserve the mood of anticipation. The best thing is not the thing we brood on. We are meant to obtain everything through the work we do on our thinking, not through ourselves. We can only fertilize our spirit through sharp thinking and then waiting. It has to stream into us when we have learned to observe the proper processes, and these processes have to work together with the thinking, feeling, and volition. There are three parts of our soul life: thinking, feeling, and volition. A person sees a rose. They recognize it as such through their thinking life. They admire the form and color. That awakens certain feelings in them. They stretch out their hand to grasp the rose, and thereby express an act of will. But important results depend on the way in which the person now treats these characteristics, which can be crucial for the rest of their life. For example, a person might meet another one toward whom they feel a pronounced antipathy. They see that they cannot free themselves from the person they dislike, and the feeling that is aroused by that constraint makes them angry. Thinking, feeling, and the will are involved in this process. The different courses which these processes take can often be observed in daily life. The anger of one person quickly ebbs away. They do not want to carry such feelings around with them for long, and the better feelings gain the upper hand. Another, in contrast, carries their anger with them for the whole day. They do not find the flexibility to shake it off. The first person who quickly shakes off their agitation will remain a mentally healthy person. They might reach a great age. But the other who becomes angry at every little thing and carries their anger around with them for a long time will age early. Such constant agitation will eat away at their body. There is a saying, "Never go to sleep angry." That is when the effects start to weave in the soul, and we weave the passions into the human being. What we experience out of the spirit acts on our soul, and it is quite a different matter whether our experiences only remain theoretical or whether they are transmitted to the feelings. Let us assume a person incorporates much of a spiritual nature in themselves, and what they incorporate penetrates the human being. What is incorporated really only becomes productive for the spiritual human being when they embrace what is incorporated with enthusiasm and love. Only at that point does that work also become work of the inner human being. They draw out the spiritual and make it a part of their spiritual eye. It is the feelings which help us to make our spiritual acquisition our own. Human beings live in an aura, and when the theosophical truths are incorporated by the spiritual human being, the aura is strongly set in motion. The I, capital, is the motor of that movement. How is that process revealed to the clairvoyant I, EYE? When love and enthusiasm for the great spiritual thoughts take hold of the human being, everything comes to life in the aura. And the result of this higher thought life is such that it has a cleansing effect on the aura. All material wishes and musings gather into balls, and these balls become denser and denser as our spiritual work increases. They become smaller and smaller until the purifying light of spiritual thinking has dissolved and dispelled them. When the clairvoyant eye sees a person watching a sunrise, similar phenomena can be observed. Something similar happens in the aura of the observer in the reverent joy which the person can feel in this natural spectacle. For as long as such a person lets something beautiful act on their interior, the effect of this process is a dissolving one in the aura, and many bad things are turned to good. Being able to take pleasure and the ability of contemplation have a purifying effect on the soul, and in such moments the soul is capable of assimilating new spiritual things, because the stream of higher forces has found an entry. But the opposite can also happen. When a person does not allow a great natural spectacle which has acted on them to linger in their thoughts, if nothing remains in them of all that beauty, and they turn to other things after fleeting enjoyment, the following can happen. Everything conglomerates in the aura of such a person. A soul and spiritual task which they came across was carelessly ignored, and now lives itself out in the dark. Then it can happen that lies find entry into their interior. Working on the ability to let an event leave an impression on and be preserved in the feelings, that is the work of the spiritual human being. If all of us learned this, then spiritual science would lead to paths and goals which would be widely beneficial. If the only work which was done was brain work, if there was strife and discord among theosophists, little of what is bad would be transformed into good. The law of karma will show human beings how to work in the right way. For those who can have enthusiastic feelings about theosophy and know how to find consolation in it, the higher spiritual sciences are a blessing, because they bring consolation and strength under all circumstances. No one leaves these sciences without consolation. The greater our goals, the more our striving will be penetrated by ideals, and human beings will carry them out into the world. We pursue spiritual science and interweave it with our inner human being. It penetrates us, and we can carry it out among other people. We have to work on these goals as much as we are able. We do not have the right to leave the paths and goals of the spiritual human being unobserved. It is our duty to interweave the soul element with the physical world. Human beings are the entrance gate, the only spiritual gate in the physical and material world through which the heavens can flow in. We can dissolve the lead of materialism by allowing the spiritual truths to penetrate. Only when human beings work on human development do they contribute to life and not to death. Walking the paths and goals of the spiritual human being means pursuing the task of turning the supersensory into the soul element. The end of Lecture 5. You are listening to RudolfSteinerAudio.com. You can hear these podcasts as well at rudolfsteiner.podbean.com. Please consider becoming a patron. As well, there are two publishing houses, steinerbooks.org in America and rudolfsteinerpress.com in England, which are the sole publishers of Steiner into English and have given me permission to do these recordings. Please consider patronizing them as well. This is a reading of Collected Works, Volume 125 by Rudolf Steiner, 14 lectures entitled Paths and Goals of the Spiritual Human Being, Life Questions in the Light of Spiritual Science, translated by Christian von Arnim. This is Lecture 6, given in Munich on the 26th of August, 1910. If I make the attempt today to sketch out the current state of philosophy and science, then the reason for that is that in the widest circles of spiritual scientific views, there is not always the clarity as to the way we, as anthroposophists, can establish a proper relationship with what otherwise exists at present in spiritual and scientific endeavors. I have occasionally included philosophical matters in the courses of spiritual scientific lectures, taking specialist areas as a starting point. I have spoken specifically about the philosophy of Hegel and its connection with the present time. Today I want to take a somewhat broader view of the subject and talk in general about the current situation of philosophy and science. Since I announced what the subject would be, and the participants in my courses already know about the form which such philosophical interludes take, you will not be surprised when I say from the beginning that I am not particularly concerned about popularity. I rather want to call forth a feeling as to how we, as strictly scientific people, can find the relationship between spiritual science and other intellectual endeavors of the present. It is hardly surprising that there is not a great deal of awareness in this regard as to what has to be said in a lecture like the one today in the theosophical literature. The theosophical writers are not, as a rule, philosophers, and are not aware of the difficulties which accrue to philosophers if they try with their basic scientific characteristics to approach the field of spiritual science. I can, of course, only highlight individual examples, but I want to choose them in such a way that when I have finished, you can obtain a feeling of how we should think about the matters I refer to. Here I will begin by saying that it can, from the start, make a certain impression on a receptive soul if we talk in the field of spiritual science about supersensory knowledge, the ascent of clairvoyant research to supersensory knowledge. It must occur to those who believe that they need to approach these things from the premises of the philosophy of today, if they are talked about at all, that the objections which philosophy raises against various things it calls direct experience, direct perception, must apply in the same way to everything we produce in the spiritual scientific field. As long as we dress our supersensory experiences in words, for example, which, when we speak them, you may not even be aware of this, make use of spatial or chronological ideas, as long as it can be shown to us that we do that, as long as we are unable to structure our terminology in such a way that we do not insert spatial and chronological ideas in our observations in the relevant place. For as long as a Kantian or some other epistemologist of the present time can come along and object, either in the old form or in the various forms which these theories have assumed in more recent times, that it was an epistemological certainty that time and space were themselves mere categories or forms of our thinking. And if we also dressed our clairvoyant results in such forms which are taken from time and space, we would, by doing that, providing something that is tied to our conceptual ability, so as a result we would basically express something with our clairvoyant results, which, I know the term is open to challenge here, is merely subjective. That is a possible objection which can always be made. I mentioned it as an example of many other objections which can rightly be formulated on epistemological premises. Only if we can raise such objections adequately for ourselves, as scientists of the Spirit, have we obtained the full inner right to postulate certain things. That does not provide a reason for not lending ourselves to certain information out of an inner sense of truth. We should do that because the inner sense of truth can lead us in the right direction. But we are only armed to respond to the intellectual movements of the present time if we raise such objections ourselves and, at least within our own elaborations, can respond to these objections. We have to distinguish between two kinds of objection. The objections against spiritual science will, of course, rain down on us from all sides. If we are in the position to know ourselves, what is raining down on us, to identify it for ourselves, and then are simply not heard with what we have to say about it, then the fault lies with the others. Then we can wait, as we must do, until people have become mature enough to understand our explanations. But if our explanations give an amateurish impression with regard to the intellectual movements of our time, then the fault lies with us, if we cannot secure the construct of our teaching in the appropriate way. We have to be capable of doing that, of distinguishing between those things where the fault lies with us, and in very many areas it lies with us. It lies in the theosophical literature. It lies in the ease with which some people think they can find their way into the field of spiritual science. We have to distinguish between the things which are our fault and the things where we can calmly wait because we are able to put for ourselves precisely the arguments which the intellectual movements of the present time would use for their objections. But if we want such a thing, we have to be clear for ourselves, above all, where the failings of the intellectual movements of the present time lie. We have to be able to ask ourselves a little how these intellectual movements of the present time have developed. You know from my lectures that I do not like to shoot my mouth off about my opinions. The opinions of an individual person are basically not of any great value. I have always tried to allow the facts to speak for themselves, also in the field of spiritual science. That is why I do not want to lecture today either about theories which are rooted in opinions, but allow the facts to speak. I want to present a fact which can illustrate how inadequacies in the thinking have developed in the course of the 19th century, which have prevented the penetration in a certain deeper way into what the thinking can still supply, if it only draws the consequences from its premises in a sufficiently penetrating, truly sharp way. Theosophy often turns out to be so faint-hearted with regard to the objections against it, because its intellectual weapons have grown blunt. If we speak only about the thinking, I know all the objections which can be raised against what I am about to say, but the matter will nevertheless present itself in this way for anyone who penetrates into the intellectual development of the 19th century. If we begin by starting from pure thinking, then we have to say that a certain climax was reached with Hegel in philosophical development as regards the sharpness of thinking, as regards the crystallization of the thinking in the soul. It is to misunderstand Hegel, to talk about him as frivolously as his opponents in the second half of the 19th century did. They imagined that Hegel was intent on removing all content from the pure thought as to what it had to say about the world. The only thing is that they failed to take into account that Hegel nowhere pretends that the human subject wanted to take anything of real world content out of the pure thought. We have to take into account that Hegel does indeed take the viewpoint that it is the thought itself, the inwardly alive thought, the active and productive thought, which fetches the content of the world out of itself. And that we, with our subject of cognition, are only the stage on which the thought works. If we take the matter in the way that it actually presents itself in the course of the intellectual life, we have to say Hegel's monumental greatness lies in this tendency. But also it contains the whole of the weakness of Hegelian philosophy. The greatness in that for anyone who truly wants to come to grips with him, Hegel can become the teacher of a disciplined thinking, which we can acquire in no other way. Theosophists in particular should acquire such disciplined thinking. After all, a great number of errors, of incorrect convictions, simply arise because our thinking does not extend as far as the crystalline clarity of an intellectual discipline as can be learned through the Hegelian system. In each lecture in which we feel a responsibility toward knowledge and truth, we should, as it were, be filled with the results of such intellectual discipline. We should get into the habit of nowhere using a word that has not first been felt and experienced by us in its full scope and content. If penetrating what appears to some to be so abstract, so dry and sober, penetrating Hegelian logic, we inoculate ourselves with this discipline in our thinking, then we reach the point where we never use the words being, becoming, existence, other than in those places where in the whole structure of the lecture those words can be inserted. Because we have first pursued the whole development of the content of such concepts, from the simplest, emptiest concepts to those with the greatest content. The philosophical lecture of today, and all of today's literatures, fundamentally immensely far removed from such inner discipline of thought. I could easily show you that in world-famous philosophical books of the present, the authors are not even able to sustain the content of a concept in a concise and precise way for more than 3 lines, and after 3 lines, use the concept they used earlier in quite a different way. It is quite obvious that this must lead to the inner muddle of the whole edifice, which is represented by our thoughts. It would be easy, as I said, to demonstrate this in world-famous philosophical books of the present time. Now, Hegel's opponents believed that they could easily put him to flight because they did not understand the nature of the thought and the way it interlaces on the stage of the subject of cognition. But they believed, something that was never in Hegel's mind, that he wanted to remove, as it were, the world content from the direct subject of cognition. That this cannot be, that we can never remove any substantial cognitive content from the respective subject of cognition if it remains only in the concept, that is something we have to be clear about. That is why Hegelian philosophy had to remain unproductive with regard to the productive progress of the intellectual life. That is its weakness. Because its underlying idea that it is the thought itself which works out of itself may be correct. But it does not follow from this that it is the subject of cognition itself which has to produce the objective content of the world. What is the only way for the subject of cognition to obtain cognitive content out of itself? It is only possible if the subject of cognition fertilizes itself, makes itself capable of producing cognitive content. But such a capability can never happen on the plane of pure thinking. Through the pure thinking we obtain a kind of overview, a kind of bigger review of what the human spirit has produced in the course of world history. From a certain midpoint, we can survey the thoughts which have been produced, but we cannot obtain new cognitive content. That was felt by Hegel's opponents. The only thing is that they based their opposition on false premises. But that is why Hegelianism, on its own, produced 2 things: a sheer, immeasurably great discipline of the thinking, and the inability to obtain productive cognitive content. In other words, Hegelian philosophy cannot have an ongoing productive effect through itself. This is the point where the productive cognitive forces have to be applied, where also Hegel's subjective cognition, which has been elevated to the level of the thought, has to resolve to allow to flow in what you can find, for example, as a means of fertilization of the subjective cognition in my book titled Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. How is it achieved? So let me say, if we start with direct sensory existence and the way human reason works on it, we reach that level which we can describe as the life and activity of the subjective cognition on the thought plane. But then, further progress is only possible if we have the fertilization from the opposite side of sensory existence by those means which are set out in my book titled Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. How is it achieved? Now, you will find in the literature, in which I have attempted gradually to draw attention to these things, to begin with in a preparatory way through my earlier writings, summarized most recently in my title Philosophy of Freedom, the path we can take from outer sensory experience, from the outer work on the material of existence, to the place where the thinking resides. You will find characterized there also the specific characteristics both of the setting of the thinking and the scope of pure thinking with regard to the subjective cognition. In my subsequent writings, which deal with the actual field of spiritual science, you will find characterized the other side of the world, with its cognition-fertilizing forces. You will find an epistemological characterization of clairvoyant research, the scope of clairvoyant research, which flows from the other side, as it were. If we wanted to sketch this subject out, we could say, if we characterize for ourselves the thinking plane with the subject of cognition on this thinking plane, then there flow from the side of sensory perception all those things which can be obtained through the senses by way of the external sensory material of existence. We feel the Hegelian self-weaving within the thinking plane, what is called the dialectic of pure thinking. But then we come to a standstill if we take only this path. We have to wait until we are able to let flow into us on the other side that which we can receive by way of what is described in my book titled Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. How is it achieved? So we can see that these things come together, and that the Hegelian system was a wonderful summary of the human spirit at a specific time. But once this had occurred, those things had quite properly to happen, to which the Hegelian system could not rise. The plane where the subjective cognition has to be located is fixed. It cannot be raised. It can only be described from the other side with that which can equally be epistemologically assured, so that we do not remain one-sided, but acquire the possibility to gain an insight into the strictly epistemological method also in those areas where we leave the sphere of just the senses. When we look at all of this, we can ask, how can it be that philosophy itself shows itself to be so reluctant to engage with those logical forms which can equally be used to determine what comes from the other side, through which we can determine epistemologically what comes from the other side? The reason for this is that the philosophy of the 19th and into the 20th century has so far neglected to take this step, which should have been taken out of an Hegelianism understood in the right way. And so it happened that the philosophy of the 19th and 20th century could not find the connection to what lies beyond the thinking plane. However, the deeper reason also has to be sought in the fact that Hegelian philosophy was little understood in the further development of philosophy. Because if we rise to the plane of pure thinking, then it is quite inevitable, because we stand at the boundary to the spiritual world, that we can also feel those logical reasons which allow us to recognize that it is quite justified for the supersensory world to flow in. You can thoroughly feel this when you encounter such an ascent of human cognitive knowledge to the pure thought, and then the way that the higher worlds are allowed to shed their illumination in the lectures of our dear Dr. Unger, lectures which cannot be praised highly enough. Hence we have to emphasize that it is the greatest blessing that we are in a position to have such a person among us as Dr. Unger, who is able in this spiritual and philosophical field to elaborate and execute the epistemology of the pure thinking with regard to the subject of cognition, which is located as the I, capital, on the thinking plane. And thus these lectures in particular can give you something of an indication for obtaining assurance in the relationship between spiritual science and the other intellectual endeavors. If you pursue this philosophy, some of which has already been set out in Dr. Unger's remarks, some of which still remains to be set out, then you will see that this philosophy will have a quite different character as philosophy to what exists today as contemporary philosophy. A truly not insignificant thinker recently said something about the latter which basically cannot be challenged. If we look without bias at what has been produced in Germany and other countries, then we can see that what this thinker said really is coming true. That today we have metaphysics without a transcendental conviction, epistemology without objective meaning, logic without content, psychology without soul, ethics without commitment, and religion not grounded in reason. That is a characteristic of our time, as experienced by a not inconsiderable philosopher of the present. As I said, I want to let the facts speak for themselves. Let what is happening speak. Whether it has to be said that he had no inclination to engage with the spiritual scientific path, or whether in the suggestion of his thinking he could not do so, is neither here nor there. But we have to say that this is how someone can think who is fully engaged in contemporary activities, but cannot find the way out to supersensory content through the thinking. Certain prerequisites have to be fulfilled in the thinking, which today cannot really be found in any other philosophy than in what I have tried to establish in my book titled Truth and Knowledge, in what is set out in title The Philosophy of Freedom, and in the carefully executed operation of Dr. Unger's thinking. All of this provides the approach to an energetic philosophy from out of the field of spiritual science, which avoids mixing anything of a theosophical nature into its reflections, which aims to be strictly philosophical, and precisely through such academic rigor will fulfill its task into the future. Now we might ask, how can it happen that although it was thought that Hegelianism had been overcome, 19th century thinking in all civilized countries could not rise to come to terms with the thinking aspect in the subject of cognition in such a philosophical way? How could that happen? It cannot be my task to go into the profound cultural historical reasons. I have done that elsewhere. But today I want to remain in the field of pure philosophical characterization. The reason is that facts occurred, that it cannot escape anyone who attentively follows the course of intellectual life in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, as to how basically the thinking itself remained strong only in a single field of 19th century intellectual development, as to how elsewhere it became too dull to draw the consequences to be found in itself. There is only one field in which 19th century and early 20th century science demands the highest respect, even from the strict thinking of the spiritual researcher, and that is none other than mathematics. Everything that has been done within the scope of the field of mathematics bears the traces of sharp, penetrating thinking. Hence, also someone who, for example, undertook their theoretical studies in the natural sciences, such as theoretical physics and chemistry, toward the end of the 19th century, could very much have the feeling. The things that are handed down in such complicated formulas, which had to be learned in, for example, thermodynamics, undulation theory, Clausius's theory, and so on, are not the fault of mathematics. Anyone who went through that and had the philosophical wherewithal had the feeling. It is not the fault of mathematicians. Mathematics has become a wonderful instrument to work everything out in finely chaste systems. What was blunt were the intellectual weapons. Thus it was easy to have the feeling when working with the mathematical formulas in the various fields of physics and chemistry. As long as one remained within mathematics, everything felt secure. But as soon as one had to deal with the philosophical characteristics of what one was actually calculating, the ground started to sway in all respects. That is what emerged from the minds of those who spoke in philosophical terms at the time. Nothing could be experienced other than the purest philosophical dilettantism, which particularly revealed itself when natural scientists started to philosophize, such as Dubois-Reymond, in his paper titled 7 World Riddles, or his lecture entitled The Limits of Our Knowledge of Nature. But nothing has improved. So we may say, we have experienced the extraordinary phenomenon that the thinking in the form that is of necessity required of it by spiritual science has only remained strong and exact in mathematics. The strict requirements of the thinking are today not satisfied in any field of research. The strict requirements we demand from the perspective of spiritual science, other than in the field of mathematics. Now, I do not here wish to deal with certain contributions with their characteristics, which can be applied to the cognitive field, particularly from a mathematical perspective. I merely wish to draw attention to the symptomatic aspect of these things, draw attention to the fact that specifically in the field which has retained its wonderful inner strength, in the field of mathematics, there has come to expression most clearly how the thinking of the 19th century is ready in itself to break